I am so pleased that you're here because this conversation is particularly important at a gathering focused on diplomacy. While we're all aware that defense and diplomacy go hand in hand, all too often the conversation remains in only one of these realms, and this distorts the full picture when it comes to international cooperation. So much energy within the US space sector has transitioned to the defense and security side of things in the past 13 months, led by enthusiasm surrounding the Golden Dome. At the same time, I've also witnessed this transition with our international partners, many of whom recognize the dual-use nature of almost everything in space. And of course, there's the reality of multiple conflict periods or theaters right now. We've heard time and time again that America first does not mean America alone. And so that is a part of the name of this session and something that I do want to dig into here right away. And Todd, I think we'll start with you, and we'll start with America first. How have you seen the America first framework and mentality shaping U.S. approaches to allied space cooperation today?
Sure, and thank you for having us here today. Glad I can be part of the panel. I would start by saying that the America first, but doesn't necessarily mean America alone. It's very much true. But what we have seen in this administration is a focus on just moving ahead with the priorities they have in space, irrespective of whether or not allies want to move ahead with us. So I think that's really how it's being operationalized. And to a certain extent, the administration can do that because, the contributions of allies pale in comparison relative to what the U.S. can do itself in terms of funding, in terms of technical capabilities. The U.S. can push ahead with a lot of these things on its own, and to do it quickly, it is much easier if you don't have to negotiate with different allies and partners and who's going to own what and how you're going to share data and all those intricate details. Now, that does not exclude partnerships. It just means that the partnerships are going to be a bolt-on after the fact. And we're seeing that with Golden Dome as well. The administration is pushing ahead with it. Of course, Golden Dome is not exclusively space. It might not even be majority space at the end of the day, but they're pushing ahead with it. And if countries like Canada or Japan or other NATO allies want to be part of it, they can bolt that on there in the future, but necessary in order to move ahead.
Well, I think many space companies think it's part of space. We're wanted to be. Clayton, I want to follow up on the Golden Dome with you. So as the Golden Dome moves from concept to architecture, how do you see allies being integrated in ways that strengthen deterrence without slowing execution?
Yeah, Frank, I just want to echo what Todd said, that Golden Dome, I know we think about it, we think a lot of the space capabilities that would be part of Golden Dome, but it's really not about space at the end of the day. It's about missile defense. So you look at missile defense now, you look at the challenges of having systems that are integrated across allies and partners. I think of NATO's work on integrated air and missile defense and the challenges there. So one way to kind of split those challenges is the sensor side. So that's everything from detecting a launch to tracking a launch to everything in the kill chain. No commander is probably going to say, I want less capability. So the opportunity for allies and partners are just more sensors on each part of that kill chain. I think that's an integration challenge, but this is something that, at least from a NATO perspective, from a U.S. perspective, we're pretty familiar with that, and it's hard. Then the other half of that is really kind of the intercept side. There's another area where you could say no commander is going to say I want less, that I don't want more capability. So it's a question of integration there as well. But with the interceptor side, you just look at the different layers of intercept, and you see opportunities for allies and partners to handle that maybe from their own national jurisdiction. So maybe a sensor network, a sensor web that is just kind of an amalgamation of various sensors that are looking globally. If they're looking from space, they might be looking regionally or locally if they're ground-based. And then added into that network of interceptors, which could have more of a national focus and looking at particular regions, and that might be a way that you can kind of carve out different areas of responsibilities that has maybe the U.S. at the center of that, but then has the allies and partners kind of contributing in both of those buckets.
I want to stick with Golden Dome for just one more moment, and Todd, maybe kick it back to you. So if Golden Dome accelerates missile warning tracking and possibly space-based interceptors, what mission area groupings would most improve coalition interoperability, and what should be first to align with combined space operation partners?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different parts to it. I would say, first of all, the biggest gap that the United States has, and certainly our allies and partners have as well, is that, missile tracking, missile warning capability. That's where we have the most deficiencies. And in particular, I would also add to what Clayton said, Golden Dome is not just about missiles, it's also about airborne threats. And so, they're saying now it's, class 3 UAS and higher is what they're focused on. And what we're really missing is being able to track, especially those lower flying drones like we're seeing coming out of Iran right now on a global basis, using systems, unlike ground-based radars that aren't extremely vulnerable to being attacked by these drones. So the airborne moving target indication mission area that the Space Force is pursuing under Golden Dome, I think is absolutely the most critical thing that we can be working on right now for the U.S. and for our allies and partners. And then, related to that, second to that, I would say is the command and control and being able to integrate allies and partners and their shooter networks, the interceptor systems they already have and are going to be building for the future, being able to integrate those so we can seamlessly pass data from all of our sensors, into their systems on the ground that can help take out those targets.
Can I add something to that, Frank?
Please.
Just, Todd, hearing you talk, I was just thinking that, again, I look at how NATO operates, and a lot of the integration challenges, we've kind of done them before, but what is different, I think, about a lot of the airborne threats today is that just the speed and the timeliness of the decisions that need to be made and the amount of data that needs to be processed. That is very different to me. So it's an integration challenge, but also how do we make sense of all that information at tactically relevant speeds?
Cortney, hi, welcome.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for being here. Let's start out with a broader question for you. How is the international community approaching space governance and partnerships within the security arena?
Sure, thank you. And thank you for having me. Thank you to Meridian for having me here today. So I'm at RAND. Some of you might know us. We're a nonprofit analytic organization. And I mention that because we've recently been doing work on the topic of how the international community themselves wants governance mechanisms built, as opposed to how does any one country want them built and then imposed on the international community. And so I brought with me today some notes from a report we have not yet published, but it's coming out very soon. I've read it, it's written, it's coming out soon, on what we found. And we've been hosting a series of workshops around the world. I get to be here with you today, but my team is actually doing a workshop right now in Geneva. They didn't get to be able to be here with you today, so I got to be here for this very project. And so what they've been doing is meeting with stakeholders from the space sector on multiple continents to have conversations about what do different parts of the space sector, the industry representatives, government representatives, as well as the NGO community and the research institutions want from governance. Do they even want governance, first of all, but want from an ability to mitigate risks from dual-use systems, which is really any military system has a dual-use capability as well. And what are they looking for? And what we found is that different regions of the world really have very different interests. That currently in the Americas, not just the U.S., but in North America, there is an interest for very market-driven approaches, like let's not impose an overhead governance structure, but let's let the market self-regulate. The view from Europe and Eurasia is that the market will not self-regulate and that there needs to be some kind of governance framework to mitigate the risks that weapons in space will cause. The perspective from the Indo-Pacific region, we've brought together Indo-Pacific countries as well as Australia, has been that it's fine to have all these conversations, but we really need definitions. We need to explain what do we mean by weapon, what do we mean by dual-use system, because as you go from country to country, culture to culture, or even within the same country, within the U.S., we see this from meeting to meeting. What one person considers within scope when we talk about dual-use systems or we talk about weapon systems, another person says, well, that's benign, that's a commercial system. And so having definitions for what is it we're actually governing. One of the findings so far, this is a 3-year research effort, so one of the preliminary findings so far seems to be that there's an interest in creating a sort of international governance around behaviors and effects rather than the specs of the system. So in a real-time situation, something's maneuvering erratically, or a signal is being jammed, and the source, the provenance of the jamming is maybe unknown at the immediate moment. Figuring out intention, user identity, and the actual specs of the thing that might be doing the attack or the maneuver is hard to figure out in that moment. Is this like some subtle jamming and interference, or is this actually something that could be turned up and it could ruin my transmitter? And so rather than trying to figure out which systems have which ultimate capabilities and what the intent of those operators are, there's been a lot of conversation we're hearing on instead wanting to understand what effects and what behaviors can be identified immediately, as soon as they happen, and how can we create frameworks for those. And so that's the work that our team is still doing. That's what they're in Geneva today doing, and we're really excited to see what comes out the next year as we continue this.
That's exciting. Let's stick with the dual use theme a little bit. I know Randall's been doing a lot of work on that. And you mentioned sort of dual use with respect to commercial companies. Where should the U.S. draw boundaries when it comes to tech sharing when commercial or allied systems become operationally critical to deterrence?
So my personal opinion is not going to be that of the government. And I'll tell you, my personal opinion is I want as much sharing as is possible. I always want as much sharing of ideas, of software, of systems, of operational control. This is my own opinion because I think that advances the science for humanity, that advances capabilities of all the countries. And quite honestly, from a security perspective, the more we're working together, the more we're co-entangled with each other's systems, the more we rely on each other, and we need to remain peaceful. It's not in our best interest to cause a dangerous situation when it's going to affect all of us, maybe not equally, because some countries won't be as evenly affected, but that it will affect all of us. So I'm a huge fan of as much sharing as possible. The reality here in the US, as well as in other countries, is export controls, as you're alluding to and mentioning, and how those are, what's the right word? How they're enforced and monitored it's an ever-growing conversation. I think the US has made some great efforts in changing the guidelines and the processes. But we were saying in the green room backstage, and my colleagues might have some other comments on this, that changing processes and regulations doesn't immediately change behaviors or the culture around sharing and the insecurity that partners and actors might have on, am I allowed to have this conversation? Should I even enter this conversation with this other entity, or is it going to be a waste of both of our time because it's not going to be able to go anywhere? And so more awareness and understanding of how the processes and regulations are actually being implemented, I think is really important across the whole community.
Actually, well, I want to jump in here to export control and ITAR, because we only have I have too many questions for the amount of time that we have, but this is an area that at Meridian we've seen be a hindrance when it comes to the international space cooperation efforts that we're looking at. So, Todd, I want to ask you the question here. For years, allies have said that export controls, not strategy, are the biggest barrier to real operational integration. If deterrence in space increasingly depends on coalition architectures, how much risk should the U.S. be willing to accept in reforming ITAR to enable trusted allies to contribute at the scale we want?
Yeah, no, I would say my personal experience having worked in the space industry is that ITAR and other export control regimes are a huge impediment. They, Congress and the previous administrations have improved those regulations, absolutely. The problem is, as Cortney was alluding to, is that the memory of those restrictions has seeped into the institutions and the processes, and that's very hard to get out. And so people are still very gun shy and very worried about exchanging technical data with other companies or countries whenever it comes to anything related to space or even tangentially related to space, because the controls were so tight after the whole Chinese incident back in the late 1990s, where there were some egregious violations, but we kind of reacted and the pendulum swung too far. And even though we've moved regulations back, like it's still there. And at the end of the day, the biggest impediment, I think, at least my own anecdotal experience, is that people are deterred from having conversations, and people, even though they know they should be able to do something, they're worried and they want legal cover, so they rely on hiring outside counsel to go and navigate things and talk to people. It's very expensive. And in the end, it hurts the smaller businesses on both sides. In the US and in other countries, it hurts the smaller businesses the most. And they're the ones who potentially have the most to gain from this type of collaboration, across borders.
Absolutely. We've seen that firsthand on many occasions. So what's the solution there? Clayton, Cortney?
Fix it, Clayton.
Well, I mean, I've always just thought I want to hear, as a researcher, concrete examples of where ITAR or export control blocked a deal. Sometimes I just don't have really good examples of that. I hear a few onesie-twosie things, but if I want to make a case on what we should change, the lack of examples, specific examples, sometimes make it really difficult. But Todd, that makes sense, and Cortney, you too, that a lot of this is just mindset and just fear that somehow I'm going to hit a brick wall. So that there's a lack of an interest in even trying to pursue a deal. So the examples of that too are useful, but I do think if we're looking at we need to change a specific regulation or a specific law, we need to be able to give that to policymakers so they can say, aha, this is what I need to change. It's just saying that ITAR or export control are bad and blocking my ability to do business with foreign customers, I don't think that's enough, because I think that's what companies have been saying. So I think we have to have a little more specificity.
I mean, one specific thing I would offer is that we need someone tracing down the bottlenecks in the approval system. And there are some cases where I've seen where it comes down to one person at like the NSA or some other agency who's required to review all of these, export applications for a certain type of thing. And that person, there's just too much work on their desk. There are too many requests coming in. And so that's where you have to pay, expensive, well-connected attorneys who know that person and can call them and grease the wheels and pull your application to the top of the stack. Again, the whole system's unfair, right, when it works that way. So we need people who will be ninjas within the bureaucracy, who will go and try to find these bottlenecks and start breaking them down one by one.
I have one more thing to add on this. And we are living in an era, though, where a lot of countries, including our allies and partners, they want to have their own sovereign capabilities to build something or operate something. So even if we didn't have ITAR or export control, I think it would be a difficult environment for U.S. companies in that space trying to sell to foreign governments or foreign customers because of that preference. We have that preference, too, in the U.S. I just can think of all the money that Germany's putting into defense and space, and a lot of those contracts, those are going to be tied to Germany. So they need to have some entity there in Germany that's doing the business. They could have suppliers that are U.S. companies, but it has to be a German entity that's doing the contracting with the government.
This could be for either Cortney or Todd, but commercial companies, firms like SpaceX, are now central to U.S. space defense architectures. Is that a deliberate strategic choice, or is that just inevitable given where innovation and capital now live?
It was absolutely a deliberate and strategic choice, and I could show you the strategy documents back to the 1980s that led the course to where we are today, because I read them as part of my job. There was a time that maybe some of us have forgotten where the U.S. was very worried about its ability to do heavy lift launch, and that the U.S. heavy lift launch market was seen as being a monopoly for sure, but really reliant on one provider that really didn't want to keep providing it because it was expensive and not worth the effort so much. And the U.S. government was in a position, and by government I mean both the military through the Air Force as well as the intelligence community through the NRO, were both in a position where Congress started worrying, can the U.S. put in space the things we want to be designing and building on the ground to put up there? And so there were congressionally mandated studies, presidential commissions that were conducted in the 90s for sure, but even after 9/11 in the 2000s and the aughts, that looked at how do we as an economy address this problem. SpaceX will tell you, and there's an asterisk if you look at their timeline online, that they started with DARPA funding. It's not a coincidence that it was DoD government funding that started to put the first seed money in what we now call a commercial space company, but it was a government-funded startup initiative when it first began, and that seed money at that juncture was critical. There was no case to give a venture capital investor back then to invest in this, but DARPA was there with it. And I don't want us to forget that history, that government investment in early stage, not just R&D, but also early manufacturing, things where maybe we understand the science, but we don't know how to manufacture it at scale, more cheaply, more efficiently. I mean, those early funds are essential.
I think we're still seeing that with SpaceWorks and some other groups today as well.
Yeah, so, to add a little controversy to the panel, I'll offer, a slightly different, interpretation of history and what happened. I mean, to what Cortney said, yes, that's all true. And I think it absolutely was government policy to, hand a lot of these things over and rely more on commercial, particularly in launch. That was policy back to the 1980s, no doubt. But the bureaucracy absolutely resisted it as much as they could, right? And so was this a deliberate choice? Not by the bureaucracy, not by the Air Force, back before the Space Force. SpaceX had to sue its way in to get its first launch contract with Air Force Space Command back in the day. So, I think the way that we ended up with the, dependence and interdependence between the military and the commercial space sector in the U.S., there was policy guidance that was pointing in that direction. But I think really what made it happen is that the commercial space companies advanced the technology to a point where the government just could no longer resist it. That it was so much better, so much cheaper, that it just made so much sense they could no longer, the bureaucracy could no longer turn them away.
I guess with the time we have remaining, I'll ask each of you, what questions should I ask you here? What should we be thinking about when it comes to U.S. national security space cooperation internationally? Clayton, I'll start with you.
Yeah, one thing that I always think is really interesting, just historically, is there's a 1912 agreement between Britain and France that divided their naval forces in areas of responsibility between the Mediterranean, that was for France, and then the Atlantic and the North Sea was Britain. So essentially, they were relying on each other entirely for their national security. I don't know if I see that happening today with the way that we look at space for national security, meaning that the United States and other allies and partners, and I mentioned, the desire to have sovereign capability. I think we're all going to want to have our own capability to do everything. I don't see a scenario where we say, well, we're going to do this, and then we'll let these other allies and partners do these other things, and the whole machine doesn't work unless we all bring our pieces together, kind of like the International Space Station works. It won't work if one of the partners isn't there. So we run the risk of redundancy and duplication, especially if we don't have good integration and how all that's going to work together, because we're just kind of complementing each other. We're not actually dependent on it. When you're dependent on it, you're required to make that integration work. When it's just a nice to have, augmentation, resilience, maybe that impetus isn't there. So I'm just saying, I think we need to make sure we have that impetus to actually make that integration work when we're all bringing essentially the whole kitchen, everything in the kitchen sink together, and we want to mash it together and make it work.
Now I have follow-up questions, and I don't have time for them. Took to the end of this. Cortney?
I'll take us in a different direction from that. There are some amazingly visionary ideas on where the global space community is going to go in our lifetime. And yet, there are going to be risks that we know are going to come to fruition and we are so ill-prepared for. A human will die of non-natural causes in space. How society handles that, what are the circumstances of that human's death? Is there blame cast, whether it's negligence or malicious act? There are absolutely situations that we need to have the international forums, quite honestly, like this, so thank you for doing this, to have the conversations that will allow us to have those conversations. There is going to be someone who's going to start the first mining in outer space, and questions are going to be raised before that mineral, that element comes back to Earth on who owns it. And these are questions that we need in international community and diplomatic dialogues to be able to address, because it's inevitable that they're going to be happening.
Final word.
Sure. I guess I would just say that, international cooperation works best and international cooperation endures when the nations involved have shared objectives and cooperation is mutually beneficial. And when those conditions are not present, it's not going to endure. And so what I think we need to be looking for are areas where we have shared objectives with our allies and partners. We're not divergent. And where it would be mutually beneficial. It can't just benefit one side and not the other. It needs to be mutually beneficial. I think that's the way that we build strong, cooperation that will endure the test of time and endure strains in our relationships in the future.
All right. Well, thank all of you for this conversation. Again, it's important that defense and diplomacy work hand in hand and with respect to international cooperation.